Hi, everyone, and thanks, Steve, for the invitation to come and speak at the TCOYD series of lectures. I'm Pratik Choudhary. I'm a doctor. I work in the UK, in Leicester, and we're going to be talking about an education in psychology and technology on overcoming hypos. So this is where Leicester is. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's not Leicester or Leicester, it's Leicester. And it's famous because King Richard III his remains are found here a few years ago. And just an interesting bit of trivia, of course, our local soccer team is called the Foxes. And a few years ago, they won the league at odds of 5,000 to 1, which is one of the biggest kind of upsets we've ever had in the football league there. I spent about 15 years learning about hypoglycemia and doing a lot of the research I'm going to be talking about in London, actually at King's College London, but I've been at Leicester for the last year. And so just a bit more about me. Yeah, as I said, I work almost exclusively with people with type 1 diabetes. I've had a real interest in hypoglycemia and how to support people in avoiding hypoglycemia, restoring awareness, and a bit about why do some people lose their warning signs of hypoglycemia. And so those are the sorts of things that we'll cover in there, hopefully with a bit of science and a bit of practical stuff tied into that. So I guess the outline of what I was hoping to talk about was kind of what is a hypo or a low. It might be a relatively straightforward question, but let's dive a bit deeper into that. And then kind of broke it up into why do people with diabetes feel what they feel when the sugar levels go low? And then why do some people not feel what they should feel when sugar levels go low? And if that happens, how can we help them start feeling what they should feel to minimize the risks of hypoglycemia as things go forward? So that's kind of the storyline for today. So let's start off with what is a hypo, what is a low, as you might call it. And I put this picture up because it's one I've often used in talks or lectures about hypoglycemia, because a low means different things to different people. And if I take this one step back, ideal blood glucose control is getting as close to that edge as possible without falling off. And if you look at this man here, of course, there's a lot of things that help him get close to that edge. I wouldn't say it's the equipment he has, which in diabetes, having the right equipment, having CGM and pumps and things helps you get close. But he's got some skills. He's got motivation to get close to the edge. He's not that scared of falling off, which is something we'll talk about a bit later. But maybe he's got a safety net under there, and some sort of techniques to help him. But the point in today's setting, the reason why I like this picture is a low for some people. Is it that cliff edge that you can see? Or is it the more gentle slope into hypoglycemia? And I was at a patient meeting, an international patient meeting organized by one of the companies. And I put this question into the chat, and it was really interesting to see the responses back that people hadn't really thought about it. Clinicians like me might say, well, low is 70 or 65 or whatever number you've been told about. And then is that kind of a hard cliff that if you go past that, something terrible will happen? Or is it a gentle slope that I'm moving towards that line? And I think how you perceive what a hypo is a really important factor into the impact it has on you. So let's look a bit about what is normal. Let's dive into this a bit deeper. And this is a CGM trace from someone without diabetes, someone like me. And what you can see there on Thursday, the 11th of September, I was at a conference. I'd walked about 18,000 steps the day before on Wednesday. That evening, I'd had maybe a little bit more than my designated allowance of alcohol. And you can see that overnight, my blood glucose levels were really low on sensor. This is Freestyle Libre sensors, which is what we had available at the time. And you can see I even measured a measured glucose of 2.3, which clocks out about 45 milligrams per deciliter through the whole night. And I put this up to show that actually people without diabetes can get low sensor glucose that lasts for a long time. You can see the next night again, Thursday, again, heavy day walking around, evening meal, and you can see there low glucose overnight. You can see the spike from the meals as well that hit kind of 7.8. They're hitting 140, 150 post meal if I've had a high carb meal there. And then of course, Friday, we finished the conference. I've sat on a plane most of the day, no alcohol, got home, and you can see there my glucose levels are normal. So in a sense, just those 3 days, that snapshot shows you how even in someone without diabetes, blood glucose levels overnight can be quite variable depending on what happened the day before and some of the factors that influence that. So there's been lots of discussion about what the appropriate level of we should define hyperglycemia as, and the kind of the latest version of the kind of medical definitions, if you like, put together by the International Hyperglycemia Study Group, IHSG, say that a glucose of 3.9 or 70 milligrams per deciliter is an alert value. And the note is that 3.5 or 65 is the lower limit of the alert range. But so 70 is your alert value. And in a sense, I think of it a bit like as you're going on the highway, you've got that hard shoulder on the side, and then the barrier is just to the side of it. So that hard shoulder is there just to give you that little bit of kind of the red zone. Don't go in there before you crash, if you like. So 70 is that sort of level. We have non-severe symptomatic hyperglycemia when people have symptoms and they can treat them. And actually the level for that, sorry, it's come off the slide here, is 3 millimoles or 55 milligram per deciliter. Because that's the level. The reason why the kind of proper hypoglycemia, if you like, in a scientific term, is about 55 milligram per deciliter is because that's the level below which you start to see a brain reaction slow down. That's the level below which you start to see some of the impact on the heart and the brain and the parts of your body and the inflammatory system that we're worried about. They don't really happen between 70 and 55. That's when people get symptoms, but actually a lot of the other things don't happen that bad. And then severe hypoglycemia is an event that needs someone else to help them out, or someone else would have helped them out had they been there. Because if someone's on their own and they lose consciousness and no one helps them, that's still a severe hypo. But then with CGM, as many of you may have had or may be using, of course, these numbers have a single dimension. It's just the depth, the level of glucose. But actually, and it's probably something to do with that idea of a cliff versus a slope. That how did you get to that number? Did you come crashing down? Did you come gently sliding down? How long were you at that number? And so CGM has this kind of domain of timing as well. And I've just put some, different types of hypos up here that we're studying for a project called HyperResolve. That's why that name is up on the slide. And hopefully in a year or so, we'll be able to talk about the impact of these different types of events. But you can see here, in the top line there, lots of short little hypos that are untreated. The second one there, again, through the day, you've got lots of short little hypos. Some of them felt by the person with diabetes, some of them not. On the third line there, you've got a lot of kind of events where the glucose has been close to hypo and then it just turned around and come back up again. So they're prevented hypos. The person with diabetes is still seeing them. He still had the emotional impact of I'm going to go hypo. They still have to stop what they're doing to treat it. And they still have an impact on people, maybe. And then you've got the prolonged nighttime hypo that's untreated. And then you've got the treated nighttime hypo where you can see just after midnight, the person found they were low and pushed it up. So I think there's lots of different types of hypos, and maybe we can't put them all into one category, and you'll have experienced yourselves. Some hypos you just kind of get on with, and some really knock you back and you can feel kind of quite rough for quite a while after. So we know that about probably a quarter to a third of people with type 1 diabetes, particularly those with over 30 years of type 1 diabetes, lose their warning signs of hyperglycemia. Between 20 to 30% of people with type 1 diabetes experience a severe hypo where they need someone else to help them out each year. That number is dropping dramatically with the wider use of CGM. And those numbers, to be fair, are from an era when we didn't have that much access to CGM. About 5% of people with type 1 diabetes though have multiple severe hypos. And I was at a meeting where we were talking with paramedics, and the paramedics in the room said, yeah, we know when we get a call from that address, it's hypo. We go there about twice a week or twice a month or whatever it is, and we know what it is. We'll give them some glucagon and they'll be fine. When you look at population surveys though, on average for people, with average glucose control as we have across the world, actually, it's acknowledged that most people get between 2 or 3 episodes of mild self-treated hypoglycemia. So that's somewhere between kind of 80 to 55 that they'll feel, experience, and treat. On census, about 1 in 10 nights will have low glucose. So if you put blinded CGM on 100 people, then maybe 8 to 10 of those will have a period of nighttime hypoglycemia through the night that they will have been unaware of. And we know the rates of hypoglycemia in type 2 diabetes are much lower, but we're not going to focus on that for today. So I'm not sure they should have used the word bad, but I think it's right, because I think, hypoglycemia, it's scary. People are worried about it. Healthcare professionals often will give you information. People have had bad experience of hypoglycemia. So let's stand back and look at the data about this. So one of the first things that comes up with is, of course, well, if you're going to have tighter control, you're going to have more hypos. And these are data from the kind of landmark study that told us this. It was a study called the DCCD. It was done back in the 80s and early 90s. And in that study, they took 1,400 people and they were randomized to standard control, which was twice daily mixed insulin. And some of you out there may have been on that sort of regime many, many years ago. And the other group got what we call intensive insulin therapy. That was either 3 shots of soluble insulin with a bit of background at bedtime, or some of them went on to insulin pumps. And this was just after the kind of invention of insulin pumps. And what they did was they were targeting really, really tight glucose levels. So they were targeting 80 to 110 pre-meal and kind of really aggressive management. So it was a treat to target study. And what we found is that red line was the conventional group. And you can see that for any given HbA1c across the bottom, the blue line, which is the intensive control arm, has much higher hypoglycemia rate than those on the conventional arm. Now, actually, people in the intensive group who had a better A1C, they got to about 7% HbA1c compared to 9% in the conventional group, had far fewer complications over time. And so after 7 years, it was deemed unethical to leave the conventional group where they were, and the study was stopped. But what came out of this was, well, yeah, you have lower complications of retinopathy and kidney problems, but you have a 3-fold higher risk of severe hypoglycemia. Now, this was not standard care. This was treat to target. And so let me fast forward 25 years to the T1D exchange, and maybe some of you contribute data to the T1D exchange, but this is the mapping of HbA1c across the bottom there to rates of severe hypoglycemia. And what you can see there is the rates of hypoglycemia are only about 10%. I said 30% in the previous slide, and so it's much lower than the background population. And I think that's because T1D exchange pulls people who have a slightly higher than usual access to technology and maybe have slightly better control than seen across the states, actually. But either way, in that group of 25,000 people, you can see that the rates of severe hypoglycemia are not that different across the patch of A1Cs. And my interpretation of these data are that those people down at 6.5% are a little bit low. Some of those people are on a bit too much insulin, but you actually don't get down to 6.5% unless you're doing a lot of monitoring, a lot of finger pricks. And so what's happening is they're on a little bit too much insulin. That has that downward pressure on the glucose levels. So there's some noise outside. I'm just going to come back to that. So these are data from the T1D exchange. 25,000 people with type 1 diabetes. And the first thing you note is that the rate of severe hypoglycemia is about 10%, not the 30% we see elsewhere. And that's probably because the T1D exchange, the best US centers, are much higher access to technology than we see in other studies. What you also see is the rate of hypoglycemia is not different, severe hypoglycemia, across the different A1C groups. And my interpretation is there's 2 things behind that. The first is the DCCD on the left there was a treat to target study, whereas clinical practice, we treat to hypoglycemia. If you're having hypos, we row back on the treatment. So it's a different way of approaching things. And that's why I never believed the DCCD hypo stuff. The second thing is that this is my idea, my hypothesis, that those people at 6.5%, particularly when these data were done, suggest those are people who are doing a lot of scanning, maybe using CGM, maybe doing a lot of finger pricks. And you need to pay a lot of attention to your blood sugars to get an A1C of 6.5%. Some of those people, every now and again, an event will slip through and you'll have a hypo event, and that's why maybe it's just a little bit higher. The sweet spot there, somewhere around about 7%. And then at the back end, running high doesn't seem to protect these guys against hypoglycemia if they have the same rate. And we'll come to that because people with an A1C of 9 or 10%, there's a reason why the sugar levels are that high. Maybe they're missing some snacks. Maybe they're doing bolusing a bit different. Maybe they haven't been taught carb counting. And often when you have, higher glucose levels have higher variability. And when you have a higher variability, when you have more high numbers, you do more corrections and they cause more hypos. So in a sense, running high doesn't reduce the risk of hypoglycemia per se, it just increases your variability, which may increase the risk of hypoglycemia. I hope that makes sense. I'll come back to that point a bit later. This is just a recent piece of data that I just wanted to share with you. And that is that if you look at the kind of red and brownish green curves, what I want you to notice is that as the A1C comes down, you can see that those lines curve upwards, which means the risk of hypoglycemia goes up quite sharply once you get down below 60, which is about A1C about 8%. So, and you can see that all the high numbers, people with a high amount of hypoglycemia, they're up there with the slightly lower, they're mapped between that A1C of what we call 50 to 70, which is about 7 to 9%. But the blue dots, you can see CGM dots, overall much lower hypoglycemia, and the lower you get, it doesn't really go up that much, except when you get down really low, under 48, that's under 6%. There's a few people with a high A1C. So I'm going to come to those people at the bottom corner there, but I think what I'm saying is with alarms and with the ability to see which direction your glucose is going in and what's happening, the risk of hypoglycemia at lower glucose levels is being reduced dramatically. So the second question was, with CGM now, you pick up a lot of asymptomatic hypoglycemia, and does it have an effect? And I just want to share these data from a group in Denmark, where they gave people some blinded CGM, and they asked them every day to fill in a quality of life question. How do you feel? How was your sleep? And one of these questions was a EQ5D VAS, which is basically a 100-point score. How do you feel today from 0 to 100? Yeah, if you feel horrible, I'm going to die, 0. I'm feeling great, life's amazing, 100. And what was interesting is that actually, if you look across with normal or impaired awareness, it says the non-NH means no nighttime hypo, and NH means have a nighttime hypo. So they measured them across, I think, 7 days. And whether someone had a hypo or not, it doesn't seem to matter. So if you have a low CGM value that you don't feel, on balance, it seems it doesn't make a big difference. Except, and this caused a lot of controversy, these people with unawareness, when they're a night hypo, they actually scored better on their how do you feel score, which was a rather unexpected finding, and one that we haven't really been able to understand. I think what it does say, though, is that low sensor glucose levels that you can't feel, we're not sure what they mean. Let's put it that way, that many of them don't have an impact on people. There are obviously some events where you've been low the whole night and you feel rubbish the next morning, and that might happen. But on average, over a large number of those events, it doesn't seem to have an impact on people, which is interesting. And as I said, other studies do show that hypoglycemia events that people feel reduce quality of their life. And so is it only the symptomatic or severe episodes that reduce quality of life? Or is it just that the tools that they use to measure quality aren't suitable? And again, that's something that we're addressing in a study called HyperResolve over the next year or so over here in Europe. So one of the main things, and some of you might be parents are worried about, is what is the impact of hypoglycemia on children? So these are data from an American group, and basically they've looked at across the years of people and the time people have died from hypoglycemia, what's the main cause? And you can see the main cause of death in people with diabetes, the same as it is in people without diabetes, is the red bit, which is circulatory disease, cardiovascular disease. On the whole, that's what gets us, and the yellow bits is cancer. So the cause of death are not that different in people with diabetes as people without diabetes, but the risk of cardiovascular, the risk of those heart problems happens a little bit earlier. And that's why I think we're getting more and more aggressive with our cholesterol and blood pressure management for people with type 1 diabetes. But what I've got in that red box there is kind of a bit of diabetic ketoacidosis. So what we've got in the year between 10 and 25, DKA is the biggest risk. Diabetic coma, hypoglycemia is the brown bits. And actually across the years, and the proportion of people who sadly die from hypoglycemia, thankfully, is incredibly low. Given how common hypoglycemia is, given on CGM how often we see these long overnight hypos, it seems like the human body is really able to deal with that quite well. And the risk of dying, thankfully, is incredibly low. In the UK, dead in bed, which is traditionally what people are scared of, it's under 10 people per year. And while for those people, of course, it's an immense tragedy and it's horrible. But if you think about the number of people who have a low glucose reading through the night, and I've had conversations with patients who've said, "Oh, I had a CGM overnight that ran low, it got down to 40, and I could have died." The probability of dying from that is incredibly low, and I think it's a tight balance to call. Where it's I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything. I'm saying that it's something that we want to avoid. It's something that with the technology we can avoid. But I think some of the dogmas about nighttime hypoglycemia worsens quality of life. Nighttime hypoglycemia can kill you. I think those dogmas are, I want to challenge those thoughts a bit and say it's slightly, the danger aspect of it is much smaller. I hope you get the point I'm making. And I guess the corollary of that is that at what point does the fear of doing something cause more damage than the actual thing? Because the fear of getting glucose levels into range and running high causes way more damage than the hypos. Could be one way of looking at that, and certainly in children there's evidence to support that. And I just want to put this up. So this was a study done by Linda and Frederick, and you can see there across the bottom we've got blood glucose levels, and below, and they gave people some simple maths and reaction time tests. And if you look at that, below 3 in millimoles, that's about 55 milligram per deciliter. Of course, reaction times went up from 60 milliseconds to 75. So that's a reasonable slowing. That's a 25% increase in your reaction time. Nothing much happens until you get down below 3.8 or down below 65. But equally, as you go up, as you got past 20, and 20 is something like 350. So as you get up to higher glucose levels, actually your brain slows down as well, and your reaction time slows as well. Now, of course, those are sugar levels that very few people get up to, but there are people who exist in that glucose level as well, and they feel kind of sluggish and slow as well. So, I just want to come back to this story about hyperglycemia and A1C on brain function. And this is a study, again, the study from that DCCD study I told you about. They've been following those guys up for 30 years now. And so this is just, you can see the white bars are people with an A1C below 7.5%, kind of the light blues are people with average control, and the dark blues people with high glucose levels. And what I want to make the point is that as you move across, this 1 to 8 are different types of intelligence, if you like, different brain activities, might be memory, might be function. And what you see is that the higher the A1C, basically, the lower that dark blue line is, which means that with higher A1C, there's reduced psychomotor efficiency, and some things get worse. So high A1C has an impact on cognitive function. There's some other studies showing, particularly in children, that if you run your A1C above 9%, there can be, that can cause harm as well to the brain function and intelligence and how connections are made within the brain. But if you look at severe hypoglycemia, again here, the blue bars, the white ones are no episodes, the light blue ones are over the 18 years, they've had 1 or 5 episodes, and the dark blues are multiple episodes. And actually across the patch, not a huge amount of change in the brain function, except for one domain where you can see there number 7, where there was a big impact. So there wasn't a huge impact of recurrent severe hypoglycemia on brain function over time. The brain, particularly the young brain, seems particularly resilient to hypoglycemia, to hypoglycemic events. And I think the data, we did a big survey looking at a number of different studies, and really the only impact was found in people, young children who had lots of severe hypos under the age of 10, where there was a bit of an effect on memory. But, those studies that did show an effect, they were having more than 15 severe hypos per 100 patient years. So they're having a lot of hypos that might affect speech. So moving on, what's behind the symptoms people get from hypoglycemia, and why do some people lose them? So this is my schematic of kind of what happens in hypoglycemia. As blood sugar drops down, it's about 80, that between 70 and 80, you've got a brain glucose sensor. It's in your hypothalamus, which is just between your eyes and a bit behind. It's just on top of your pituitary gland, if you've ever had a thought of where that is. And that part of the brain kind of controls a lot of the core functions of the brain. And it's got a few cells there that are very reactive to glucose. So the brain glucose sensor, that's where we think the brain identifies glucose. And then if you're low, from there, we think that there are 2 main areas that it sends signals to. So it sends signals to the part of the brain called the anterior cingulate that drives the stress response. And that drives your adrenaline, and that adrenaline will then drive, typical symptoms that you've got: palpitations, anxiety, tremor, sweating. Those are the main symptoms of hypoglycemia. There's another part of the brain that deals with interoception, and interoception is monitoring of the internal brain, which I'll get to. As glucose drops lower, you see around about that 60 mark, between 55 and 60. That's where neuroglycopenia, brain glucose deficiency, starts happening. And as the brain starts to decide, hang on, I've got to I've got to feed blood to the bits that are important about staying awake and consciousness. And I can do without stuff like memory and coordination and speech. And as the glucose drops lower, then it starts saying, right, I'm going to shut you down, make you be a bit drowsy, and just protect you, because we can't be burning the glucose if we don't have the energy. Ultimately, it's a combination of your adrenergic symptoms, palpitations, your neuroglycopenic symptoms, and this thing called interoception that leads to awareness. Something's not quite right. What is it? And it's your experience. This is probably hyperglycemia. Your brain recognizes it from its memory banks, and then it guides the frontal parts of the brain to say, right, what do I need to do about this? Let's make an action to restore this, experience. What happens with the repeated hypoglycemia, though, is that the cerebral brain glucose sensor probably gets adaptation. I've seen this before. I don't need to do anything about this. And so it stops sending those signals out to the adrenergic system. So you lose your adrenergic symptoms. It also stops the interoception a bit, and so you lose awareness, and all you're left with is neuroglycopenia. Now that exists. However low your glucose goes, once it drops down to a certain level, the brain is gonna rearrange the blood flow, and you're gonna get those symptoms. Now, a lot of people with type 1 diabetes who have impaired awareness report that, oh, I can function perfectly well. I've had some people saying, oh, I used to have a lot of hypos, but now I don't get them, and I can get down to a glucose level of 40, 50 without symptoms, and I function fine. More often than not, people around them will notice that they're not quite functioning as well as they could do. A lot of people get very good at hiding that, but actually when you take them to the lab and you drop them down, you'll see their reaction time slow down. And it's a bit like, it doesn't matter how much practice you get at drinking. If you've drunk a certain amount, you're going to be unsafe driving. Same sort of thing. And so just to picturize that, those with hypoglycemic awareness, they get their symptoms at a higher level, and that brain dysfunction, that neuroglycopenia happens at a lower level, and they've got a gap, and that's your hard shoulder, that's your warning area. But people with unawareness, those symptoms happen lower, and a lot of people say that they often are too confused to realize that they're confused, and that hampers their ability to manage things. We know that impaired awareness is a problem for about a quarter to a third of people with type 1 diabetes. And that puts people at about a 4 to 5-fold higher risk of those severe hypo events that can cause damage. So there's a very simple screening tool that clinicians often use. One's called the Clark score, one's called the Gold score here. Simple question: do you know when your hypos are commencing? If 1 is always, 7 is never, and if the answer to that question is over 4, 4 or 5, that probably closer to that, say that you're never aware of when hypos are starting, then you've got impaired awareness, and you should be thinking about ways to avoid to treat that or manage that. So when we think about this was a lovely study done in Sweden, and what they did was they divided the group, and they looked at their fear of hypo versus their risk of hypo. And tell me if this strikes through, and you might score yourself. Where do you think you sit in that group of in those 4 groups? So let's start with the green group down there at the bottom corner. So you've got people who've got a low risk of severe hypoglycemia. They have good warning signs. They have a low time in hypo range, and they'd have a low fear of hypos. They're not really scared of hypos. They get on with things, and that in this study was about 43% of people. Then there's a group, 32% of people who have a low risk. They have a low time in hypoglycemic range. They have a good warning sign of hypoglycemia. They don't have any other risk factors like kidney problems or cognitive problems, but they're very scared of hypos. And the sort of people, as the glucose is getting down, as they get towards that edge, they see it as a cliff. They get scared and they immediately do something to push it back up again. So and that behavior means that they have a low risk, but actually have a low risk of hypoglycemia, but they end up running much higher than they need to. And so it's an abnormal fear. And then you've got some people in that orange corner there, top right, who have a high risk of hypoglycemia. They've lost awareness of hypoglycemia. They might be spending a high percentage of time in hypoglycemia. And they have a high fear. They're scared of it. They don't like it, and they make adaptive behaviors around them. They have someone near them. They have a CGM with alarms. They put the alarms on high, and they're making appropriate behavioral modifications to minimize that risk of severe hypoglycemia. And then finally, you've got that bottom corner, which is a group that I'm really interested in. People have a high risk of severe hypoglycemia, but they have a low fear of hypoglycemia. So they've got lost awareness. They've had previous severe hypos. They've got a high time in hypo. But they don't seem to be scared by it. And they don't seem to take on board treatments or advice that can reduce their risk of hypoglycemia. And we got interested in this because of a little study we did where we just looked at people in clinic and, we said, every time people come into the doctor, we'd make some recommendation, adjust your insulin, change it, do whatever. And the HA, the hyper aware group, when we just looked back in the notes next time they came back and said, did they give it a go? And it might have worked, might not have worked, but did they actually try to do it? And it turned out 80% of people had tried to do it. So we were very pleased with ourselves. And then we looked at the people with impaired awareness of hypoglycemia, the hyper unaware group in the green. And if they come to clinic with a hypo problem, most of their advice we can assume would have been around avoiding hypos. But what we found was that actually only 40% of the time they'd even tried it. So we did some more work on it, and we found that a lot of those people had low concern. They were part of that bottom group in the previous slide who weren't worried about hypos. They didn't want another sick role that I'm hyper unaware. They in particular, a lot of them overestimated the risks of high glucose. So they were sort of people who'd been told early on, you mustn't run high or you'll get complications. So they didn't care if they were having hypos. They just didn't want to see anything over 180 or 200. And then there's a group of people who just normalized it, saying, well, this is just the way I am, and they've adapted their life to it. And so it wasn't a problem for them. And we did the same kind of survey with a bit more nuanced questionnaires with over 1,000 people from the T1D exchange. And a quarter of people have had hypo in that T1D exchange study. Some people having had, you can see that at the bottom there, 50 people that had more than 16 events, for example. And again, we identified these 3 key thinking traps, and we call them the kind of soldier where, I'm not feeling symptoms. I know the sugar's low, but I'm just going to keep marching on doing what I'm doing because I don't feel anything abnormal. And there's some people who bury their head in the sand, the ostrich syndrome, which is, I'm probably hypo, but if I measure my glucose, I'm going to have to do something about it. I feel fine. It's not a problem. The hypos aren't causing any problems. That's their way of dealing with it. And then there's the other group who, the actual sign that we came up with was an overactive smoke alarm. But I like the picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger getting a big bad gun out and shooting down. As soon as that glucose pops its head over 150, you shoot it down with the biggest dose of insulin you can get away with, and you can deal with the casualties later. And that's actually the predominant thinking trap in these sort of people. So coming into some funky pictures, this is what I like doing. So these are pictures taken from people. And what we do is we take people, and the top 2 lines are people with no diabetes. The middle 2 lines are those with normal awareness of hypos. And the bottom 2 lines are brain slice of people with impaired awareness of hypoglycemia. So what we do is we get some people, and for some reason, they agree to come in and be made hypo in the MRI scanner. And so we can see what happens to their brains. And the red bits are bits that light up, and the blue bits are bits where the brain seems to turn off, if you like. And broadly speaking, the bits that turn on in healthy controls are areas involved with executive function, that's action, arousal, so awareness, not the arousal you're thinking of, and relay of symptoms. And the bits turning off are memory and input. And you can see a similar pattern, but that frontal decision-making thing doesn't seem to happen so much in the people with normal awareness. It might be more of a reflex action, so they don't have to think actively about what's going on. But what you see here in the people with impaired awareness, that big red blob in the middle, the bit that's around arousal and detecting the hypos, just doesn't happen at all. But this decision-making is on, and it led us to think that maybe this is the frontal and this is the kind of intelligent part of the brain saying, we've seen these hypos before, don't worry about it. And so the model we come up with is that the thalamus is kind of the intelligence center looking and screening for, is anything going wrong, any incoming problems? And it picks up the hyperglycemia, and it has to decide, is it friend or foe? So it sends the information out to the frontal lobe saying, hey guys, there's this low glucose thing, is this problem? Do I need to do something about it? There's a decision making. Do I send off the adrenaline? Do I send off my symptoms and my behaviors to avoid hypos at the panic stations? Or do we chill and say, this has happened before, we know it's friendly fire, we can survive this? And in people with impaired awareness, versus awareness, you make a different decision, as you can see. And maybe another way of doing it is it's the substrate on which that forms it, this type of person you are. So it's a bit like if you had some nylon strapped onto you and you jumped out of an aeroplane or a car in this case. The same stimulus, it will drive the same brain response, the stress response as a hypoglycemic event will do. But you can see that some people might do this and say, this is so much fun, I'm going to give up my job and I'm going to become a professional skydiver. I have low fear. And there's other people where if they've done that once, or even if they see it, they'll get extreme fear of hypos, and won't be able to do that again. And so that may be the two different responses you get, and why some people end up having impaired awareness and some people end up having fear of hypos. And there's something about how hypos are introduced to you. I remember a patient telling me, or sorry, a parent of a young lady telling me that, you know, when we were diagnosed with diabetes, the doctor said, here's some pens. You need to jab your daughter 5 times a day to keep her alive. Oh, and by the way, if you tightly screw up, you know, screw up a little bit with the doses, and she's going to be close to death, here's another pen that will bring her back from the death. And of course, that's not the way it was explained to them, but you can see the impact and which of those two messages are heavier for you. I want to avoid complications, or hypoglycemia is bad, marks out your behavior towards your response towards those two extremes. So can we restore awareness? Well, there's a lot of studies done where if you avoid time in hyperglycemia, you can restore awareness and bring some symptoms back, although rarely fully back, but enough to be aware of what's happening. And you know, we looked at all the different things that can do this. So hypoglycemia specific education, carb counting, reduces severe hypos by 50%, restores awareness in 50%. CGM, certainly, I call it technology monotherapy, first line therapy technology, reduces hypos by 50%. And if you combine them, dual therapy, pumps and sensors that automatically turn off or close loops in today's world, this is 5 years old now, reduces severe hypo by 87%. So we can almost get rid of all the nasty severe hypos if we have proper access to technology, and that's really exciting. And then in Europe, I ran the islet transplant program at King's for 10 years. And of course, the results from that are amazing in terms of hypoglycemia going away and glucose levels flattening out. I think, you know, we've got Steve in the picture there. You know, technological revolution has really helped us deal with hypoglycemia, giving us better control and starting to get the machines to do the work. But there's still a bit of behavior, and let me just map this out. So, you know, often people will underdose or miss a bolus and the glucose will go up. And it might be because I hate diabetes or I'm scared of hypoglycemia. And then you get a high number. And when you get a high number, there's guilt, anger, frustration, fear, some sort of negative emotion that often drives a overcorrection. And then as soon as you've overcorrected, glucose are dropping, there's panic or fear. And so you overtreat to prevent the hypo and you end up going up. And this is the sort of picture that I see routinely in people who are told, oh, my diabetes is brittle, or when the doctor says you've got high variability, or people have high anxiety or fear of hypos. It's this behavior. And the key thing here is that the insulin and the food are not in the same time zones. You've got food pushing the glucose up, and then insulin taking it down, and then food pushing it back up again. And whilst you've got insulin and food in different time zones, you're always going to have those problems. So that's kind of my key tip. And I often say the way we balance that out is we go aggressive bolus up front, wait, soft correction if we need it. In fact, one of our mantras that we use in clinic is kind of scan or check your glucose, bolus for your meal, wait 15 minutes, because whatever they say, it's novo sluggish or humo slug. These insulins are not fast enough. Then you eat what you need to, then forget about it for a couple of hours, see where you end up, and then take them up and then adjust it from there. And to explain that model, I use this kind of tennis analogy, where whenever you're hitting a bolus, it's a bit like you're teeing off on the golf course. Now, you ain't going to hit a hole in one every single time. And even if you choose the right shot, you've carb counted, you've adjusted for the wind, you've adjusted for the exercise, you've done all those things. You know, you're not going to hit a time. As long as you get it on the green 60 to 70% of the time, you're doing amazing. Your risk of complications is really low. Even if you hit the right shot, something might happen between here and there that you end up in the sand bunker. And things are going to be, that's a hypo, and things are going to be a bit crazy for a while, but it'll settle down. And then even if your carb ratios and your bases are all correct, 30% of the time you hit it short and you need an extra dose to get it on target and a little correction. You've got to let that first one settle before you do the next one to avoid stacking. And so, you know, I use this to try and take away the pressure that every glucose level has got to be flatlining. And, you know, we talk about flat, narrow in range, but we know that even with a time in range of 70, 75%, your allowance to run high over 180 is about 25% of the day. And 25% of the day is 6 hours a day. So I think that's a really important message to avoid the panic of seeing that high glucose in the, in that high zone. As long as you've made the action, you should be fine. So finally, if you come back to hypos, if the issues around thoughts and cognitions that are driving those behaviors for hypos, shouldn't our treatment address those thoughts and emotions? And here in London, we pulled together a program. It's actually being tested now in the Jocelyn, and it might spread across the US, we hope. But we look at, it's an education that uses motivation to being CBT and patient empowerment over 6 days, delivered by trained educators. And we're currently testing that against another program called blood glucose awareness training. And the early results are that actually, in this high risk group who've had multiple severe hypos, this approach has been really valuable and helped them move forward. So in summary, low blood glucose is common. Education and technology are really powerful tools to help reduce the risks. The way people experience those depend on their recent glucose levels, depend on their awareness of hyperglycemia, and a bit about how your brain is wired, how those early messages about risks of high and low and anxiety drive your emotions. And so addressing and acknowledging and addressing those thoughts and emotions around your individual view on hyperglycemia is really important to help you improve time and range, avoid nasty complications of hyperglycemia, and get that flat, narrow, and range controls. Thanks, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye.